All right, everyone, what's good? Welcome back to the Brawn and Brains podcast with me, Kev Gomez, and Ben Stanners. So this is now kind of the second batch of education series videos that we're going to be doing. So we're going to be kicking things off with advanced training. We're not going to be going like super mega in depth on many things because I'm expecting a lot of the people watching this probably just won't have a huge need for that, and it'll probably just kind of end up just talking gibberish and things that aren't really applicable to a lot of people. But with that being said, there are certainly some things which we feel people could be much better off knowing, almost kind of stemming off some of the things that we discussed last time, taking some of those concepts a little further in depth, potentially kind of some myth busters on some sort of training related ideas, because I think the whole sort of advanced training thing kind of lends itself to what others with a much bigger amount of muscle mass are perhaps doing, and people perhaps trying to replicate that when they shouldn't be. So we'll probably touch on a fair bit, and yeah, we'll get right into it. So I think one of the good things to kind of jump right into is last time we were talking about the idea of training stimulus, the idea that there's many different kind of adaptations we can seek from our training. And I think a good one to kind of delve into is the idea of trainability and adaptation, even more so, because I think there's still a lot of things that people potentially get a little bit skewed in this regard. And for starters, I'd like to give a bit of a shout out to Kasim Hansen, because I originally kind of came across the idea of trainability from him, and some of the ways that he put these concepts made a great deal of sense, because I think a good one to actually kind of jump into from there is the idea of sort of mixing training stimuli, one that we're both kind of against to a degree, because on the idea of adaptation, it doesn't make a great deal of sense in my opinion, and I think the way that Kasim worded it actually made a great deal of sense. So if we think back to our first fundamentals of training video, we considered the ideas of, a stimulus or a stressor, I guess we also call it in this case, because when we're going to talk about recovery, I think it is important that we, recognize that a stimulus is also going to be a stressor.
It is a stressor, yeah.
The idea of stimulus plus recovery equaling adaptation. Now, I think to come along with this is almost the idea that adaptation is almost a checkbox that can be ticked, almost a condition that we kind of need to be met, whereas almost that gap between the amount of stimulus and the amount of recovery almost being labeled trainability, and that almost kind of being able to vary based on potentially how much stimulus we're getting versus how much recovery we're getting, whereas almost that adaptation almost being like a conditional checkbox to be ticked. Would you say that's a fair way of looking at it for starters, Ben?
I'd say it's a reasonably fair way to look at it, yeah. I would say you could look at it as ways of different thresholds, because I think thresholds always creates this idea that in order to tick that box, you need to reach a certain level or do a certain amount of something to reach that. So I like the way I like putting it or calling them thresholds to reach.
Yeah, good stuff. On the training / stimulus side of things and the recovery side of things, I think that's even more important, because I think that then kind of gets into the idea of sort of mixing training stimulus. So if we imagine that, we have, when we look back at last time, and we consider the different adaptations we can look to achieve, whether perhaps being some sort of, more neurological adaptation, maybe hypertrophy, maybe some sort of metabolic adaptation, we're obviously going to need a certain degree of, stimulus that we're eliciting to actually, get ourselves to adapt in that way. And again, that's going to come down to more so a threshold, as you were saying. We're going to need a certain amount of stimulus. And of course, with that being said, we're going to need, at the very least, that same amount of recovery to at least return to baseline, or if we do want to adapt or remain in a trainable state and keep that checkbox of being able to adapt actually ticked, we're going to need that recovery threshold to certainly be met, and ideally, as recoverable as we can be. So I think it's worth considering that obviously a different stimulus is going to be an additional stressor.
Yeah.
And that can come not even just in terms of one's training, but also all other stresses that accumulate in life. We've touched on this when we talked about stress management in our little Fitbit series. So, hopefully if you're watching this and already thinking, Jesus Christ, what are they on about training stimulus and stress management and Jesus?
Yeah, go back and watch.
This is why we've now done these advanced episodes, because even though these aren't like super complicated ideas, it still requires sort of that fundamental understanding of some of these ideas. So go watch those other videos if you haven't. But if we're thinking about sort of this accumulation of stresses and stimuli, really, then that should immediately start kind of setting off some light bulbs in your head about why we may actually want to make our training specific to what we're trying to achieve. Because if we are, trying to achieve, for example, let's say hypertrophy, and as we have discussed, neurological, adaptations and metabolic adaptations can certainly, lead to better hypertrophy in the long term and indirectly, but fundamentally, if we're trying to get bigger, we should be training for hypertrophy, and that should be the stimulus we're trying to elicit. If we're trying to get bigger, and we've got a certain threshold that we need to meet in terms of stimulus to elicit that kind of adaptation that we're looking for and getting bigger, then once we've met that stimulus in the ways that we may have discussed in the previous video, then it doesn't then make a great deal of difference if we then go, or positive difference, I should say, because it can certainly make a negative one, actually, as I'll tell you. It doesn't make a great deal of sense, I should say, to then go do a ton of other work almost for the sake of it. Because, again, I think people get very caught up on that idea of there being, multiple, mechanisms of hypertrophy, again, as we touched on in the last video. And people seem to feel the need to kind of try to tick all of these off within a given training session for some reason. But again, these are just going to be, additional, stresses, if anything. And potentially, if due to then other external factors, in life, that we may be in a slightly less trainable state due to stresses being a little higher and potentially also recovery being a little lower, and therefore that gap in between being smaller and therefore less trainable state, then, these additional stresses going much further beyond that threshold that we need can potentially actually hindering our ability to adapt in the way that we want.
Yeah. And the easy way to think about it is basically a stimulus is a stress, but a stress isn't necessarily a stimulus. And so that's an easy way to think about it. But, let's give an analogy. So the reason why I like to call them thresholds is because it's an easy way to think about it. So, you've got these different forms of stimulus, which again are stresses. So, you've got your sort of quote unquote hypertrophic stimulus, your metabolic stimulus, your neurological stimulus, right? But let's think about them as gas tanks. They're three separate gas tanks. If you top up the hypertrophic gas tank and then you haven't reached that threshold, and you therefore then also do a metabolic finisher, which is dumb, by the way, you're not topping up this hypertrophic gas tank. You're then you're topping up this metabolic gas tank. So you haven't actually added to reach that threshold if you haven't done enough on that front. So that's where actually I like you change your language before, which I liked, because you haven't actually done enough of one stimulus to reach the threshold required, which, like you say, you originally said didn't have an impact, but then you actually said didn't have a positive impact. And that's key to understand, because although it won't have a positive impact, it could have a negative impact, because the rest of this analogy, well, these gas tanks, these three different gas tanks lead into one big gas tank, which is your total stress load. So you've now not done enough of one stimulus to reach the threshold, but you have then added to this other gas tank, and they feed into this big gas tank, and that's just adding to this total stress load without actually ever reaching a certain threshold for a certain stimulus. Does that analogy make sense?
100%, yeah. That's a good one.
So again, understanding that's why we don't want to mix different stimuli is really important, because we've got thresholds to meet. Once we've met those thresholds, we don't need anything more. And if we do more, then either we're going to go into a state of not being able to recover, or we're going to just waste potential progression, potentially, because we obviously have this term of minimum effective volume, or minimum effective dosage. And I think that
that's a better word to use.
I think the dosage is a better way to put it, because we only need to achieve that minimum effective dosage, because if we do, it leaves, again, if this is our maximum progression we can make, and this is our minimum effective dosage, we've got all this room to play with. If we start here, we've got this room to play with. Less progression by trying to do too much.
Yeah.
So again, we don't want to mix stimuli for that reason. And then again, understand how that can actually negatively impact your ability to recover, and your ability to adapt is key, because again, it's just creating this total much greater stress. More stress means you have to recover from more. But again, if you're not really meeting this certain thresholds for certain stimulus in the first place, what are you actually going to be adapting to? Chances are you might get some adaptation to what you're trying to achieve, but it's definitely not going to be as good as it could be. And again, that's important to understand. But maybe you won't get any adaptation. Maybe you'll just bury yourself into a hole. Like that. That's the risk you are running. And that's just on the training front. You've then got to consider life stresses, work stresses, relationship stresses, and how that all feeds into this big gas tank as well. So that's, this idea of metabolic or a finisher or just any kind is just, it's silly, because what does it actually achieve other than making you feel like you've worked a bit harder? But again, feeling like you've worked harder is just a feeling, more so than something that actually makes sense to achieve.
All right, so we actually just took a break because we just confirmed our next guest.
Big one.
You guys can enjoy that one. So we actually have no idea where we left off, and so I'll let Ben just go kind of back into it, because I know he had some other stuff.
I can't actually remember specifically what I said last. Got a bit caught up in the excitement there, but basically, trying to do all these different stimuli at once is obviously, as we've kind of briefly touched on, they're problematic in the short term, but also problematic in the long term, because again, if you're using all your tools at once, then where do you go next when you start to stall, and when progress is start to stall? Again, this is where periodization is key, because it allows you to continue to progress, maybe in a slightly different way.
That's where I wanted to go with it, actually.
Yeah, but it allows you to progress over time by using these different stimuli, again, at the appropriate time when it's needed. And again, this is the beauty of programming, because it's like you don't just use these different stimuli randomly. You don't just go, well, I'll finish a hypertrophy phase, so now let's just go into a metabolic phase because why not? Sort of, no. The beauty of programming is, how does each phase lead on to the next, and how does the next phase build upon the previous one? That's the beauty of programming. So understanding how to do that, it's a skill, but a good coach should have that skill. But it comes from understanding the different stimuli, and it comes from understanding how they can use the tools to help you achieve a long-term goal, and but also that short-term goal within that that mesocycle. I guess that's the important thing to remember, is that it still stems down to this ability to think long-term. Because again, it's easy to do. That's where I left off. Right. Perfect. So it's easy to want to do a metabolic finisher, for example, because it makes you feel like you're working harder. But that isn't necessarily a good thing. So it's that, again, that stems from this, maybe this ability to feel like you need to do more, or impatience. But again, if you have this greater ability to think long-term, you realize you don't need to do that for, again, the reasons we've stated. And it gives you this platform to continue to progress over time by periodizing properly.
Yeah.
One thing I kind of want to add before we necessarily move on to periodization is that understanding that you talked before about, there's a recovery threshold as well, but understanding that sometimes programming can actually deliberately put you into an overreaching phase, so you can get some form of super compensation further down the road. Understanding that is also a tool to use as well, because again, it's not always like you have to recover as hard as you train. That isn't always the case. Again, it's, as we've said, well, to be fair, we're recording a lot of videos this day, but so on this day that we're recording, as we've said many times, it's the right tool for the right job at the right time.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I think there's still actually a couple of things that I'd want to quickly finish up on there before moving on to periodization. Yeah. I think that actually leads very nicely into periodization. So that's definitely where we'll go next.
Yeah.
I think based on what you were saying, I think it's also worth helping people understand that, that on the adaptation side of things, for one, depending on how you're adapting, understand that, a stimulus will become sort of less effective over time. Now, another rule to not abuse, don't assume that means muscle confusion. Please don't assume that that's what we mean by that. But that is, another important element of periodizing your training and understanding, again, sort of that idea of where Ben was talking about, where do we go from here? Understand that sort of as you stall, you will have to sort of analyze, why are you stalling? Where am I going to go with my training to facilitate more progression with this? And that is kind of the idea of, a stimulus will become less effective over time as we have adapted to, to that stimulus better. And that's another kind of important part of, periodizing your training. And on that note, understand that when it comes to programming, as we sort of touched on last time as well, although certain things may be associated with certain stimuli, that also is dependent on someone's sort of current state of adaptation, as it were. We did talk about last time how, some people may associate metabolic training with higher rep work, how, neurological stuff may be more so looked at as sort of heavier training and stuff, even though it's probably more so, I guess, about the application of the tension more so than anything. But certain things can certainly be associated with these stimuli, even if not, completely, even if it's not completely resultant in that adaptation all the time. But that it does need to be understood that just because that's associated with it, we also need to look at things on an individual level, because, someone who's maybe coming out of a metabolic phase will probably be better conditioned and understand that, a 10 rep set for them probably it isn't going to be, very metabolic because they're so well conditioned. Whereas for someone, a 10 rep set may be, very demanding in that sense because they haven't adapted as well on that side of things. So also from a programming point of view, understand where you are, understand where your clients are in terms of their current adaptations, and again, periodize around that. That segues very nicely into the idea of periodization, which we did kind of touch on a bit on the previous video as well. But particularly again, as you get further down the line in terms of advancement, the whole idea behind this video is, where do we go from here, I guess, because as we talked about in the last time, I think we talked about it when we talked about sort of volume and frequency and stuff. When you begin training, pretty much everything is going to work because, that threshold for stimulus is hella low. You can pretty much do anything to tick that off. Usually, I guess, as you're younger, life stresses are going to be lower. Generally, recovery is going to be higher as well. So you are just going to be in a more trainable state when you're newer to this whole thing anyway. So progress is just going to be through the roof. Whereas as you get more advanced, as you start to kind of stall in certain areas, you are going to have to put a bit more thought into things. So even though some people might be listening to this thinking, you guys are overanalyzing things way too far, I'd say this is actually really still quite basic, to be honest, in regards to just being able to improve as you carry on. So yeah, I wouldn't quite call this, overanalyzing things. I think this is actually still rather basic, to be fair. But on the concept of, periodization, that is the idea of, looking long-term, thinking about the adjustments that we can make to training in terms of kind of blocks and phases, to again, sort of get the outcome that we're looking for. This can be periodization in terms of, the adaptations that we're looking for. If we're looking more so at, the bodybuilding side of things, this might be periodization in regards to, the variables that we're setting up our training around to kind of maybe influence, certain hypertrophic outcomes when we're maybe looking at things like lagging body parts and stuff. So yeah, there's a whole host of ways that we could really periodize our training, again, looking at the outcome. But this is something that Ben and I are sort of hugely fond of and looking long term anyway. So I don't know if there's anything you kind of want to go into right off the bat, Ben, in regards to sort of periodization.
I think the most important thing, and again, kind of already been touched on, is when it comes to periodization, is just the ability to do it properly. And again, understanding that periodization is still dictated by, number one, the long-term goal, but also the short-term goals. But then again, these short-term goals should be, how do I get to that long-term goal? So, again, not doing things randomly is really key, because, this is where we need to question why. This is why, this hopefully will show why we're not overthinking this. We need to question why we're doing certain things, because we're not questioning why we're doing it. Again, how do we know we're going to get the response we're actually after? You can think of periodization as like a roadmap. And the better you have that planned, the straighter that road is going to be. But of course, that road is never going to be straight, because life will also get in the way. No matter who you are, life will get in the way to some degree. And so again, periodization is important because it doesn't just take into account your training, it does take into account your actual life. So if for example, you've got a busy few weeks of work coming up, you can go, right, well, my training's going to periodize. So around this, I'm going to maybe take a deload, for example, because I'm dropping one stress to compensate for another stress going up. And again, we've got to remember that this analogy of the total, this big one tank that is all your stress load, again, that matters because that tank can only be so full before it becomes a problem. So again, understand that periodization isn't just for continued progression, but it's also to make that road smoother, to work around other areas of life is really, really important. I had something else to add as well. I can't remember what else I was going to say. It was oh yeah. I know we're talking about the advanced training here, so to speak, but again, understand that periodization isn't just applied to training. It is also applied to your nutrition and to your supplemental protocol as well. And then understanding how, again, the way I actually like to plan it for clients is like, you got training column, you got nutrition column, maybe you got your supplemental column as well. It's not just about, again, the periodization works down for individually for one of them, but how does it work across as well? Because they need to go together. Yeah, so, really, really easy example would be, you're in a metabolic phase. That's the phase of training you're in. Okay, how do we support that nutritionally? Carbohydrates. How do we support that supplementally? Something like beta-alanine, something like that. Avoid any major anything that contains a lot of antioxidants, something like that, because again, that's going to blunt that signal. Just simple considerations, but again, not going to go too deep into that because this is obviously on training. But again, something we're trying to make really clear is we can't just talk about these variables in isolation because they always work together.
Yeah.
And that's something that's key with periodization, is it's not just for training, it's for everything.
Key for sure. Yeah, good stuff. I think from there, it's another one that's kind of quite good on sort of the advanced side of things is, again, sort of what we mentioned earlier on periodization. Is a lot of people feel as they kind of get further into training and bodybuilding and fitness is the idea of lagging body parts. And I think that kind of opens up a whole can of worms. But again, on the periodization side of things, that's one way in which you can sort of periodize your training. And, if we're looking more so on the hypertrophy side of things, perhaps sort of placing a certain emphasis on bringing up certain body parts and stuff. Which is definitely useful. Obviously, your programming should reflect your needs. So again, periodizing sort of around your body parts as a bodybuilder is pretty important. But also, again, take into consideration, what state you're currently in terms of your adaptations. Take into account, the way the way that you're periodizing stimulus and all that.
Yeah, and I just want to very quickly jump in and add the reason why we're not telling you how to periodize is because, again, that very much depends on the goal. So we can't say how you should periodize because we don't know your goal. We don't know you as an individual. We don't even know who we're talking to or who's listening right now. So I just want to, if you're looking for that direct answer, we can't give that because we're talking in a general sense. So what we're trying to do here is just make you aware of potentially the importance of periodization and maybe how you can start to apply it. But in terms of the specifics, you will need to work that out for yourself or, hire a coach.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, good stuff. I think people actually might want to know kind of our thoughts on the lagging muscles. I think that periodization thing, actually, that's the lagging body part's probably a good one for us to touch on advanced training and bodybuilding and stuff. So yeah, we'll actually go into that kind of worms for a bit, actually. So yeah, I think a lot of people at this point might sort of feel like they have potentially sort of lagging body parts and stuff. For starters, I think it's worth understanding, do you actually have a lagging body part? If you've only been training a few years and your arms are maybe just slightly lacking behind in your rear shot or something, it's quite likely that you probably don't need like a real specific phase geared at bringing up your arms. But if you actually do, then yeah, this will go quite nicely because this will link it nicely into some mechanics that we'll probably go into later and stuff. So
yeah,
how do we feel it's best to bring up lagging body parts? So I've made my views quite obvious on Instagram and stuff. So I think fundamentally we should be looking at execution because mechanics is important, as we hammered in on our last fundamentals of training. Physics is the way the world around you literally works. So it'd make a lot of sense to actually carry that over to your training and consider the impact of something like physics. Yeah, the way in which you execute a movement is obviously going to dictate a lot of how tension is applied to a muscle. We can look at things like your intent and explosiveness and how this kind of impacts momentum and inertial properties, but that's probably getting a bit too nerdy for this. So or is it actually?
It's weird one because we are talking advanced here, but like how advanced do you want to go? We could go super in depth, but then you could say this is in the second episode, so maybe we should just hold it off for another episode or something like that. Like, because we could go deep if we wanted to.
The point being, we can. I guess now we can kind of at least plant some flags for people to go kind of look further into. I guess. So,
yeah.
Now, on the note of execution, obviously, the way in which you execute a movement, as I said, is going to have an impact on how tension is applied to the muscle. The tempo of your reps, the explosiveness of your reps, everything is going to impact, how that tension is applied to your target muscle. So if you are not being super meticulous with how you execute your movements, then that is step one, I'd say, fundamentally, in bringing up a potentially lagging body part. On the note of sort of mechanics and stuff is exercise selection stemming off of that. I guess that kind of stems into execution anyway, because, potentially movements which you might find yourself a little more tempted to cheat and stuff on, or movements which, the way you execute may not necessarily have the mechanics and leverages to apply the tension the way you'd want to the target muscle. Exercise selection is very important because, again, you're going to be able to place yourself in a position where that tension is actually going to be able to be applied to the muscle in the way that you'd want it. So, it comes kind of part and parcel, doesn't it, when we consider mechanical tension as, a very important driver of hypertrophy. And, again, mechanical tension, the way that it's applied in terms of the mechanics is of the most importance. If you're not familiar with things like moment arms and inertia and stuff like that, even though it may sound very nerdy, it will have a bearing on these things because while the fundamentals remain, we're still looking to progressively overload and get strong and stuff when it comes to our training, especially as you get further down the line. You're going to have to find ways to actually really keep the ball rolling because eventually the basics won't work as well as they used to. So exercise selection, I feel, is probably the next point of call. Coming off of that is still, things like progressive overload. Part of that mechanical tension thing is just, more mechanical tension. And part of that will just be increasing the load that you're using on onset movements and continuing to progressively overload. So that, I think, is probably a good step 3. And then once all of those are ticked off, then we can look at kind of manipulating things like volume and frequency and those other training variables that we discussed in the first video. Can you potentially tag on a bit of extra frequency to those lagging muscle groups if you can recover? Yeah, sure, because again, we still need to be ensuring that we recover so that we can progress. Can we look at a bit of extra volume kind of per session to, perhaps meet that, threshold of stimulus that we were talking about earlier? If we can recover, for sure. But, again, these things can't come at the cost of progression. I don't know if there's anything you sort of want to add to that.
Indeed, Ben? I do indeed. So I think one of the key things that it comes down to, and this is something that I've always said, and people just always gloss over this, especially the more sort of quote unquote hardcore bodybuilders love to gloss over this, but people don't consider how the impact enjoyability has. Now, what I mean by this in terms of a lagging body part is if it is a quote unquote lagging body part and it just doesn't seem to respond as well, then because you're not getting the result that you like, the result that you're used to, the result that makes you feel good, enjoyability goes down. What happens when enjoyability goes down? Effort goes down. Who the hell puts, that most people can't grow their calves. Who the hell puts a lot of effort into growing their calves? You don't, because you don't enjoy doing it. Right? That's very, very clear. So realistically, we can throw all the other shit we've said out the window and we just say, actually, you know what? Put some effort to actually training them. Do it for a while, because again, you didn't grow the rest of your body overnight, did you? It took years. So actually put effort in for years and then watch as they actually do respond. It's because of the lack of effort that's always the case. And again, that does tend to stem from enjoyability. Now, that enjoyability might come from the fact, again, because they're not getting a response in the first place. And like I say, you don't get that, I guess, that feel-good factor would be the best way to put it. Because, if you get results, you feel good about getting the results. If you don't, you don't feel as good. And like I say, less enjoyability, less effort. It's very, very common. Very, very common. I think most people just don't put the effort in when they don't see the results. They lose that quote unquote motivation and don't put the effort in. And I think that's one of the key things to understand. Again, effort combined with patience, because it isn't going to happen overnight at all. Then yes, then I would look at the other stuff. Execution, I think, is really, really important. Potentially using the priority principle. I don't think that's a must, but obviously the priority principle just states that, putting where you want to prioritize at first when you have the most energy and you're not fatigued at all. It makes sense, but I don't necessarily think it's a must. You could say it would make a difference to effort, but I guess that depends. It might not, but I guess, again, that depends on how the rest of your session looks. But I think, the key thing would be effort, patience, and then execution is going to be the key things, because, again, most people will, if it's lagging, they might think, well, I need to, just train this harder, maybe go a bit heavier, but then you might lose the execution side of things. We've talked about priming phases before. We've talked about learning proper movement patterns. People will do that for a squat. People will do that for a deadlift. Is anyone going to do that for their calves? Is anyone going to do that for a bicep curl? Probably not. But again, you then potentially miss out on proper execution. So again, it's also come along with that effort and enjoyability. It also comes along with just your mindset towards those muscles that tend to be weak, is because, again, you don't get the same response and you start to view them differently for whatever reason. Is it human nature? Maybe, but again, being aware of that can help you to fix the problem in the first place. So I do think more than often than not, it is actually more of a mindset thing.
Yeah.
And it's the way you approach trying to train them because of that.
I'd quickly like to interrupt though, because I think that the priority principle is a good one to touch on, actually. Because I think, as you said, although makes sense, definitely not a must, because again, it kind of comes back to the idea of, is it at the expense of other things, and potentially when we're looking, I think a very popular one is sort of the lagging arms crew, And you know, a lot of people might then think, you know, if I'm training pull, does that mean I, you know, do some bicep work before back? Well, I'd say there probably not, because that's probably going to have an impact on the rest of your session, come at the expense of something else.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
if we're looking at I do like how you mentioned sort of that it might have an impact on something like effort, and this is where I definitely think that is the case, because particularly if you train hard, you know, you are going to mash yourself throughout your session. So if we do look at something like a pull session, if you're doing, you know, a couple of sets of biceps at the end, when you're pretty mashed off something like deadlifts, rows, etc., you're probably not going to put a great deal of effort into training your biceps, and therefore probably not going to grow. This is why I feel like, you know, something like playing around with sort of your volume and frequency can come in handy, because if we're looking at the frequency side of things, then we can, one thing which I've found very useful is tagging my arms onto the front of my leg day, because then I'm, you know, priority principle, while I'm nice and fresh, I'm able to go a little heavier, put a little more effort into my arm training. But on that day, it's not going to have an impact, because, you know, a dumbbell curl is just not going to mash me before my leg session, is it? So that way I can tick off some very good quality work for my arms and still not have, you know, any sort of detriment to my session after that. So I think that's an important one to consider.
Yeah, and I think then also understanding how actually, you know, effort itself does also affect execution, because if you're putting in less effort, it's more likely to be sloppy execution as well. So again, you know, effort, enjoyability, patience, I think are the key things to understand to bring up a lagging body part. And yeah, I again, just remembering that you didn't build the rest of you. If they supposedly do respond worse, then it's only going to take more time than the rest of your body. So yeah, you've got to have the patience as well, which is key. I did kind of want to go over the force application that you mentioned before. Again, if we can kind of keep it basic, but not obviously there's going to be some degree of advancement talking about it, but we'll try and keep it basic-ish. And all I really wanted to say is that
on kind of perhaps the final thing was kind of, you know, things like strength profiles and resistance, yes, like strength profiles and resistance profiles. So I think that probably would be a decent rabbit hole to go into, and perhaps, I don't know if that's kind of where you wanted to go with sort of force application as well, but
kind of, yeah. I just want to make it people aware that, you know, this is called resistance training for a reason. It's because, you know, you have to overcome a resistance. So there is a certain amount of force required to overcome that resistance. But again, depending on, you know, things like tempo and intent, things like that, and then obviously manipulation of resistance profiles as well and strength profiles, where that force comes from can differ. But the overall force needed to overcome resistance is still the same. It always will equal the same. So again, you know, if you have a lot of intent at the bottom, you can therefore create more momentum, especially as the resistance profile starts to change or potentially drop off. That force required to move that resistance is still the same, but more of it might come from momentum, for example. If anything, you might overexert the amount of force you need to do. But remember, if you overexert that force, that is wasted energy as well. Well, you're technically wasted energy because it's transferred energy, which you could argue over enough reps is going to diminish your ability to perform those reps. In fact, I wouldn't say you could argue it. I would absolutely say that is the case, especially on, you know, high intent reps. If you're trying to be explosive at the bottom, that's a lot of contractile force, which requires a lot of energy, a lot of ATP in the moment to be able to produce that much force. So again, you know, and then what's happening, like I say, is you then transferring a lot of that force into momentum, which then is what overcomes resistance, not mechanical tension, which is what you're after. So I don't want to get too much into that, but understanding there is a force required to overcome resistance, but where that force can come from can differ depending on how you perform the rep, how the rep is set up, rep execution, you know, like I say, just a few different factors that can differ where that force comes from.
Yeah, no, that's a good one, because obviously earlier I was talking about sort of like inertia and momentum and stuff, and yeah, no, so that was a good one to kind of take that one a little more in depth. I think probably a good kind of little one to go into towards the end then is while we are on kind of the physics talk side of things, I think something which becomes increasingly prominent as you get more advanced is the idea of kind of strength profiles and resistance profiles. So
everyone loves a band, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's the important one to touch on, because I think again we've had like a nice big recording session today, so we have kind of already discussed the idea that people are for some reason are just kind of falling into camps even more so, despite there just being more and more information out there. People just seem to somehow get more and more divided. And I think a good kind of way to look at that is also the band situation, and that kind of stems off the whole sort of strength profile, resistance profile type thing. So it's worth understanding that, again, due to physics, in certain exercises we're going to have part of the movement where we are stronger, part of the movement where we are weaker. This is obviously going to vary from exercise to exercise, but one way I should say in which we can sort of overcome this is potentially something like use of a band or a reverse band to try to even out the strength curve of that,
which is called accommodating resistance. It's quite literally in the name. It accommodates that resistance because you do have a strength profile of a muscle versus a resistance profile of an exercise. Like you said, a muscle is going to be strong or weak depending on where it is in terms of its own range, and an exercise is going to be hard or easy depending on where it is within that exercise, I guess. Reasons, there are different reasons why it might be harder at certain points. Again, you can look at different things such as moment arms, and then things like the rotation of axis as well, and where they are relative to each other. You could understand different angles or different planes of motion that you're traveling in can affect where something's hard as well. Again, right now, realistically, without putting this stuff together, we are just saying jargon at the minute. So we do need to make this more applicable, I suppose. So I don't know if we should give examples so people understand a bit better.
I think a good one is perhaps sort of looking at things like the chest supported row and setting up further back on that. I think that's a good one to look at in terms of kind of moment arms and axis of rotation, because I think that's a very popular setup at the moment. And I've had quite a few people actually ask me why does so and so do it like that instead of with his chest on the pad and stuff. So yeah, obviously basic GCSE physics. If we've got a moment arm, we're basically looking at sort of force to around a kind of axis and rotation. And basically the moment arm is sort of how far away from that axis the force is acting. Obviously, the further we are away from that axis, the greater the force is basically going to feel. So if we are thinking, I'm trying to think of the best way to sort of word this now. So I'm assuming a lot of people listening to this will be familiar with something like the hammer strength chest supported row. If we consider sort of the axis where sort of the arm of that machine sort of rotates, and we consider then the arm where the plate sits on further away from that kind of axis of rotation, at the bottom of that movement, that it starts out kind of, this is probably going to make a lot more sense if you're watching the video version of this, because I'll use my hands. But if we imagine sort of the axis of rotation sitting here, and then we've got the plates on the arm kind of sitting down here, as we then kind of do the row movements and pull back on the machine, we're then going to get the plates coming along like this. So now, whereas we have this moment arm down here, a much smaller moment arm, so the movement is going to feel much easier, which is actually, now I'll continue on that train of thought. Then by the time we get to the top, we've got a much bigger moment arm. And going back to what Ben was saying about strength profiles of a muscle, something like that isn't actually going to complement the strength profile of our lat, for instance. So what you might see a lot of people do is actually set themselves much further back on that machine and use kind of their arm against a chest pad to set them up much further back. And then what that essentially does is, because they've obviously pulled the machine back, we're now starting in that harder portion of the rep on the machine.
Where the lat is strong.
Yeah. And then as we then pull back, we're actually getting it moving further up to then make the moment arm smaller in relation to that axis, and therefore we actually get a drop off in load, which is again where the lat is actually going to be weaker, and therefore we've potentially got a more kind of efficient movement for the lat. However, this is actually quite important, because when we are then thinking about programming and putting a session together, it's then also worth considering that, you know, our ability to get short is obviously going to be much better when we are fresh, and is going to diminish as we fatigue. So, you know, if we are looking to actually challenge the lat more so at the start of the session, then we may still actually favor, you know, going with that initial setup and actually challenging the lat in its shortened range. But if we are, you know, actually looking for movements where, if you're thinking, oh, you know, we don't want to see a huge decline in performance, we're towards the end of a pull session, this is perhaps where we might favor a setup which does complement its strength the strength profile of the lat, and where we can get a drop off in load, and that way we can potentially get a slightly more efficient movement out of that.
Yep. And this, again, a few points to go off there. This right now, all this is, the examples we've given at least are all dictated by gravity. They're all dictated by gravity. There are examples where it's not, but they are all dictated by gravity. And again, that's just a really basic thing to understand, is that gravity is dictating all of this.
Yeah, this is essentially GCSE physics, you know. The jargon may sound complicated when we start, you know, talking about inertia and moment arms and stuff like that, but this isn't really anything, you know, crazy beyond GCSE physics.
No, not really. So yeah, and the second thing is, like, again, this is where a lot of misapplications being put in. A lot of people then have run with this and just try to make everything match the strength profile to the resistance profile, and just always have accommodating resistance. It's like,
trying way too hard.
You need to challenge where you're weak. You do still need to challenge where you're weak.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what happens is you'll just get this massive misappropriation between where you're strong and where you're weak, and the gap will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you do need to still challenge where you're weak, and that's really, really important to understand. Now, again, where we can start to then take this one further is understanding how, you know, levers start to work as well, because we've just given an example, but then that can change based on how levers work as well. Because again, basic physics, basic GCSE physics, the longer the lever, the less effort that's required on your part to be able to overcome an initial inertia. So maybe not on, I mean, I suppose technically your arm length on a hamstring throw would matter, but that's less applicable than, say, a leg extension, which, can you guess why I'm starting to go into this?
Yeah.
Do you remember why I'm going to give this example on a leg extension?
I assume you're going to refer to that one post from Instagram.
Yeah. So it's an interesting idea, but basically, you know, a leg extension, obviously the moment arm is dictated by where that pad is in relative to where your leg is. So if it's higher up your shin, the moment arm is less, because your axis of rotation is your knee. If it's lower down your shin, the moment arm is greater. So you think, well, all right, this is why it matters, though, because if you have the same amount of load, so you're lifting, say, 100 kilograms, and you've got the pad higher up your knee, you're not actually lifting 100 kilograms. If it's lower down, you're going to be lifting more, okay? But this is where lever length comes in, because, as I've just said, the longer the lever, the easier it is to overcome that initial inertia. Matters, because if you've got a higher up your knee, what does change is having to overcome the weight initially. It becomes harder. Now, does it match up appropriately so that what you've lost from moment arm is made up for in lever length? That's hard to say, and that's where we can start to get really complicated and maybe over the top. That's where I'd agree we're getting over the top. But I think just understanding that's important, because if we look at progression and you're not placing the pad the same height every single week, how do you know you're actually progressing?
Yeah.
You might think you've lifted more. Yeah, bro, I lifted 5 kilograms more than last week, but have you actually?
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's important to consider. You don't have to worry about the actual physics or mechanics or mathematical equations. but you do need to at least consider where you're just putting that height of the pad every single week, because then you can ensure that there's at least some form of standardization on that front, and therefore you can actually know your progression when you say you are, and that's where it becomes important to understand, and that's where we can apply it. Just to even the Gen Pop, we can apply it in that sense, because that's actually a really simple thing. Again, the physics and the equations behind it might become more complicated, and maybe as coaches you need to understand that. But then when you apply it, it's actually really simple. It's simple as, like I say, make sure that the foot pad is the same height every week.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm trying to give those examples.
I think that was a very good one to give, actually. Again, the idea of just knowing these things versus being able to apply them is very important, because as we said, people seem to just be falling further into sort of two camps, where it's just do your barbell rows and bench press, versus actually thinking, maybe not necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel as maybe people in the other camp are perhaps trying to do, but more so just thinking, how can we make that wheel a little bit better than just the basics? Because again, as you get advanced, you're probably going to need a little bit more. It is something that some people might view as over the top, but to that I'd say, again, is a lot of this really anything outside GCSE physics? Is it actually that advanced, or are we just actually trying to make the wheel a little bit better? And if our goal is to maximize hypertrophy and grow as much as we can, then I'd say that we'd be stupid to not be thinking about how we can apply these things.
And the example I gave on the leg extension, for some people might have sounded complicated, but like I say, all that actually translate to in real life is just making sure you have the same setup, the same foot, the same pad setup every single week. So again, you might say it's overcomplicating it, but actually it's not. It's not when you actually translate it.
Yeah,
it's just, it is actually really basic stuff when you translate it. So
and this doesn't have to change like loads about your training, because again, it's just thinking how can we make it a little bit better. Me and Ben talk about all this stuff, but does that actually does that change a great deal in our training? No. Ben might reverse band his hack squat again, to make the resistance profile suit the quads a bit better. But does that mean we go any less hard? No. Does that mean that it's nothing out of this world? That the application still, especially if you're trying to get big, the application just remains trying to make your training a little bit better. And then again, look back at the fundamentals that we talked about, still understanding things like the training variables like volume, intensity, frequency. It doesn't, these things don't change a great deal.
And let's take that back. Let's give my examples. Like, I do reverse band my hack squat because number one, I'm just very, very strong. And I the fact that I can reverse band it and lift a lot of the top is almost proving itself of why I need to, just so I can actually create the load that's necessary towards the top of the movement. But I'm not neglecting the bottom part, the bottom part of the movement, because on my other leg day, I have a squat where, guess where it's hardest? The bottom of the movement. So I'm still training that portion, but it's just understanding that you don't have to try to do, again, it leads into, I guess it kind of leads into periodization, but more so just leads into not trying to do everything at once. I'm still training that part of the motion, but just in separate sessions, but across one microcycle. So I'm still covering what I need to cover. Again, this is where you just have to put a bit more thought and detail into your programming, understanding you don't need to achieve everything at once. But as long as it's across a microcycle, mesocycle, or macrocycle, then that's good enough.
Yeah, good stuff. To be fair, I think that probably knocks out a lot of the stuff that we wanted to talk about today. So that might actually be a good place to wrap it up. As we said, we haven't taken like anything super in depth today, because we can't do like when we talk about a broader episode like training as a whole. We obviously, when we're talking for like an hour and 15, there's not a great deal that we can really cover in super detail if we're talking about a few topics. But if we can kind of use these first batch of education series episodes as either flags for you to kind of then go look further into on your own, and have some things which you're considering about how you may be able to apply to your training. And then we'll probably actually then do real episodes on each of these topics further in the future, and really kind of go in depth for the people who then have listened to this and thought, actually I would to learn more about that. So this is kind of almost just sort of a bit of a starting point from us, but we hope that you've been able to kind of take something regardless to be able to apply to your training, particularly if you have been at it for kind of a bit longer and you're thinking sort of, where do I go from here? Hopefully these are some things that you can kind of take to apply to your training.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys very much for listening. Please remember to like, follow, subscribe, show support. Always massively appreciative, especially on kind of these education videos. We do try to kind of provide some value and help you guys take some things away to be able to improve with. So yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one, and thank you for watching.
Yeah, see you in the next one.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more.
If you enjoyed that episode, be sure to check out the latest Fitbit here and the latest podcast here. Thanks for watching, guys and girls.